It was a cold, damp night in late October when Kevin found himself alone, driving down an empty stretch of highway. His shift at the warehouse had ended later than usual, and the clock in his dashboard blinked 2:37 a.m. The road stretched ahead, flanked by tall, skeletal trees that seemed to sway ominously in the beam of his headlights. The farther he drove, the more isolated the world seemed. He hadn't passed another car in miles. Kevin's fuel gauge had been flirting with empty for the last 20 minutes. He cursed himself for not filling up earlier, but in the back of his mind, he knew he would make it. There was a gas station up ahead, a small, rundown place he had stopped at once before. It was the only one for miles in either direction, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. He slowed as the flickering neon sign came into view. Gas, it spelled, though half the letters were burnt out. The station was just as he remembered. Dim lights, peeling paint, and a single pump that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. The eerie quiet of the night was pierced only by the soft hum of the overhead light and the distant rustling of the wind through the trees. Kevin pulled up to the pump and shut off his engine. His headlights dimmed, leaving him in near darkness except for the weak glow from the station. He stepped out of the car and shivered. The cold seemed to cling to his skin, seeping through his jacket. As he reached for the pump, he noticed the cashier inside, standing behind the grimy glass window. The man, older with deep-set eyes and a pale face, stared at him. His gaze was unsettling, unblinking, hollow, as if he were studying Kevin. Kevin gave a half-hearted wave, but the man didn't move. Trying to shake off the unease, Kevin inserted his card and began to pump the gas. The night felt unnaturally still, like the world was holding its breath. Kevin glanced over his shoulder toward the woods, which now seemed closer, the shadows between the trees darker than before. He thought he heard something, a faint rustling, but it was probably just the wind. Suddenly, the pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. Relieved, Kevin replaced the nozzle and went to get his receipt, but the machine only spat out an error message. He sighed, resigned to going inside to get his receipt. The last thing he wanted was to deal with the creepy cashier, but he didn't want to leave without it either. As he approached the door, he noticed something odd. The lights inside the station flickered erratically, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. The man behind the counter hadn't moved, still staring intently at him through the glass, but now his mouth twisted into a slight, unnatural grin. Kevin hesitated at the door, a knot of dread forming in his stomach. He glanced at the woods again. Something was definitely moving between the trees, just barely visible, darting in and out of the shadows. The door creaked as Kevin pushed it open and an old bell jingled weakly. The stench of stale air and something metallic hit him as he stepped inside. The cashier still hadn't moved, just stood there, hands resting on the counter, that eerie grin frozen on his face. "Need a receipt?" Kevin mumbled, trying to make the transaction as quick as possible. Without saying a word, the man reached under the counter, his bony hand moving slowly, deliberately, as though performing a ritual. The receipt machine whirred and spat out a thin slip of paper, but as the man handed it over, Kevin caught a glimpse of something strange behind the counter. A trapdoor, slightly ajar, leading down into darkness. From the shadows beneath, a faint sound wafted up, almost like breathing. Kevin's heart skipped a beat. He turned quickly to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The handle felt cold and rigid under his grip, like it had been frozen in place. Panic surged through him as he tugged harder, but it was no use. Kevin shot a desperate glance back at the cashier, who was now watching him with that same unnerving smile, his eyes gleaming with something like amusement. "You're not the first," the cashier finally spoke, his voice low and raspy, almost drowned by the hum of the flickering lights. Kevin's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" The man tilted his head slightly, his grin widening, revealing teeth that were unnaturally sharp. "The pump always draws them in," he said softly. "They never make it back out." At that moment, the trapdoor slammed open. Kevin's gaze shot to the floor, and what he saw rooted him in place. Something was crawling out. It was human-shaped, but grotesquely deformed. Its limbs too long, like its skin pale and stretched tight over bone. Its eyes, hollow and black, locked onto Kevin. The thing moved with terrifying speed, its nails scraping across the floor as it dragged itself toward him. Kevin screamed and yanked on the door with all his strength. It finally gave way, and he stumbled outside, sprinting toward his car. He could hear the thing behind him, its raspy breathing getting closer, the wet slap of its hands hitting the pavement. Kevin dove into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut just as the creature reached the window, its long, skeletal fingers scraping down the glass. Fumbling with his keys, Kevin started the car, the engine roaring to life. He floored the gas pedal, not daring to look back as he sped down the highway, his heart pounding in his chest. In his rearview mirror, he saw the gas station receding into the distance, the neon sign flickering one last time before disappearing into the night. For a moment, the road seemed empty, safe. But then, just as he was beginning to breathe again, his headlights illuminated a figure standing by the side of the road, a man with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, watching him as he passed. Kevin didn't stop. He never drove that way again, and he never stopped for gas at night. But sometimes, late at night, when he's on a dark stretch of highway, he swears he can see that same figure in the distance, always watching, waiting. It was a little after midnight when Julie found herself pulling into the dimly lit gas station on the outskirts of town. She hated being out this late, but a long shift at the hospital had left her exhausted and running on fumes. Literally. The station was old, the kind you could barely spot until you were almost on top of it. A single fluorescent bulb flickered above the lone pump, casting weak, sporadic light that barely illuminated the worn pavement beneath her tires. Julie glanced around. The place was dead. There were no other cars, no signs of life, except for a faint glow from the station's convenience store window. She could just make out the figure of someone behind the counter. With a sigh, she stepped out of her car, pulling her jacket tight around her against the biting cold. The wind howled through the surrounding trees, making the whole scene feel unnervingly isolated. The pump beeped when she inserted her card, and the slow chug of fuel filling her tank was the only sound in the empty night. She kept her eyes on the pump, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over her. But it wasn't easy. There was something off about the place. She'd driven this route 100 times before, and she didn't remember this station ever being here. A rustling noise came from the edge of the station, near the dark tree line. Julie glanced in that direction, her stomach nodding. It sounded like something, or someone, moving in the shadows. She couldn't see anything past the weak glow of the overhead light, just the thick darkness that seemed to press in on all sides. She shook her head and forced herself to focus. It was late. She was tired. Her mind was playing tricks on her. But then there was another sound, closer this time, like soft footsteps approaching. Julie's heart pounded as she turned slowly toward the noise, her breath catching in her throat. Just then, the pump clicked off and she jumped, nearly dropping the nozzle. With shaky hands, she replaced it, all too eager to get back into the safety of her car. As she turned, she froze. There, standing just beyond the light, was a figure. Tall, unnervingly still, with features obscured by the shadows. Whoever it was, they weren't moving, just standing there, staring at her. Julie's pulse quickened. She took a cautious step back, her eyes never leaving the figure. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her effort to sound calm. No answer. The figure didn't move. Julie swallowed hard, her hand instinctively moving to her car door. She glanced at the station's convenience store, hoping the cashier might have noticed what was happening. But the man behind the counter was gone. The light inside the store was still on, but the place looked empty, abandoned. Her stomach twisted in fear. She quickly got into her car, locking the doors behind her. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for her keys, eyes darting between the figure and the gas station. The figure still hadn't moved, but she could feel it watching her, feel the weight of its gaze. Her heart raced as she finally jammed the key into the ignition. Just as the engine roared to life, the figure stepped forward. The dim light barely touched it, but Julie could see enough. Its face was wrong. Hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, and a mouth that seemed too wide, stretched into an unnatural, eerie grin. The skin was pale, almost translucent, as if it had never seen the light of day. Without a second thought, Julie slammed her foot on the gas. The tires screeched as she tore out of the station, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't look back. She couldn't. As she sped down the road, her knuckles white against the steering wheel, she tried to calm herself. Just a strange person, she told herself. Someone playing a prank. That's all it was. She wasn't about to let her imagination run wild, but the further she drove, the harder it was to shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She glanced into her rearview mirror and her blood ran cold. The figure was there, standing in the middle of the road, illuminated in the glow of her taillights. But it wasn't just standing anymore. It was walking. No, it was moving too fast, gliding toward her. Its movements unnatural and jerky, like it was being pulled forward by something unseen. Julie's heart pounded in her chest as she floored the gas pedal. The car surged forward, the speedometer climbing, but the figure didn't slow. It kept coming, closer and closer, until it was almost at the back of her car. The air inside the car felt thick, suffocating. Julie could barely breathe as she gripped the wheel, praying she'd outrun whatever this thing was. She sped through the winding road, desperate to put as much distance between herself and that gas station as possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached the edge of town. The lights of the nearby houses flickered into view, and Julie dared to glance in the rearview mirror again. The figure was gone. Julie let out a shaky breath, her whole body trembling with relief. She slowed the car down, her grip on the wheel loosening. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe the long shift, the exhaustion, had played tricks on her mind. But just as she allowed herself to relax, she saw it, on the side of the road, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. The figure, standing still, watching her with those hollow, sunken eyes and that impossible grin. Julie's blood turned to ice. She pressed the gas pedal, speeding down the road again. But as she passed street after street, the figure kept appearing. On every corner, at every stop sign, always watching, always smiling. She didn't stop driving that night, not until the sun came up. But even now, in the daylight, she can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for her to stop, to slip into the shadows again, waiting to follow her home. Late one rainy night, Ethan was driving down a desolate stretch of highway on his way back from a weekend camping trip. His friends had left earlier, but Ethan had stayed behind to enjoy a few more hours in the woods, hoping to clear his mind from the stress of work. Now, with his headlights cutting through the thick fog and the rain tapping softly on the windshield, he was regretting his decision. He hadn't seen another car in miles. And the eerie isolation was starting to wear on his nerves. He checked the clock on his dashboard, 1:14 a.m. He still had a long way to go, and his gas tank was running low. Ethan cursed under his breath. He hadn't planned this part of the trip well. But just ahead, through the mist and rain, a faint, flickering light caught his attention. A gas station. Relief washed over him as he pulled off the highway and into the small, dimly lit lot. The station was old, worn down, and clearly neglected. A single pump stood beneath a rusty canopy, and a small convenience store sat off to the side, its windows dark and grimy. The neon sign above the store was barely legible, flickering open in the mist. There were no other cars, no signs of life, except for a faint light inside the store. Ethan parked by the pump and stepped out into the rain, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The station felt wrong. Too quiet, too isolated. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the flickering sign, the shadows clinging to the edges of the building. He considered driving to the next town, but his fuel gauge was almost on empty. He had no choice. He grabbed the nozzle and started pumping gas, listening to the rhythmic click of the fuel flowing, trying to ignore the sense of unease creeping up his spine. As he stood there, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced around, scanning the parking lot, the fog-shrouded highway, and the dense trees that lined the road. Nothing. Just the rain, the fog, and the dim glow of the station lights. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he thought he saw movement, something shifting in the shadows near the convenience store. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the store, squinting through the rain, but whatever he thought he saw was gone. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it as his tired mind playing tricks on him. The pump clicked off, signaling the tank was full, and Ethan quickly replaced the nozzle, eager to get back on the road. But just as he turned to get into his car, the lights inside the convenience store flickered. A low hum came from inside, and the door to the store slowly creaked open. Ethan froze, staring at the door, which now hung slightly ajar. No one had come out, but the door swayed gently in the breeze, as if inviting him in. He felt a shiver crawl up his spine. There was something wrong here, something deeply unsettling. But his curiosity got the better of him. Maybe the cashier was just checking to see if someone needed help, he reasoned. He decided to go in, if only to pay for his gas and get out as quickly as possible. Ethan approached the store cautiously, the door creaking wider as he neared. Inside, the faint smell of damp and mildew hit him. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting strange, jittery shadows across the shelves. The place looked abandoned. Dust-covered shelves lined with expired snacks and drinks, the walls yellowed with age. But behind the counter stood a figure, barely visible in the dim light. "Hello?" Ethan called out, his voice sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. The figure behind the counter didn't move at first. It stood with its back to him, hunched over as if examining something below the counter. "Hey, I just need to pay for gas," Ethan said, his voice faltering. He took a step closer, squinting at the motionless figure. As he did, the figure slowly turned. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The person, or what he had thought was a person, was wrong. Its skin was unnaturally pale, almost gray, stretched tight over a gaunt, skeletal frame. Its eyes were dark, hollow pits, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque, too-wide grin that seemed frozen in place. It stared at him, unblinking, that horrifying smile never wavering. Ethan took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. I'm just gonna go," he stammered, backing toward the door. The thing behind the counter moved. It didn't walk or step forward. It simply seemed to glide, its body unnaturally rigid, shifting closer without taking a single step. Ethan's stomach churned with a wave of nausea. The grin widened, impossibly so, and the thing began to hum softly, an eerie, discordant tune that set Ethan's teeth on edge. Panic surged through him. He turned and bolted out the door, the bell above it jingling faintly as he shoved it open. He sprinted back to his car, throwing himself inside and slamming the door shut. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the keys, the engine sputtering to life just as he looked up at the convenience store window. The figure was standing there, staring at him through the glass, that horrible grin still plastered across its face. But now there were others. More figures, pale, grinning, their eyes empty, sunken, slowly emerging from the shadows inside the store, crowding against the windows, watching him. Silent, motionless. Ethan's blood turned to ice. He floored the gas, the tires screeching as he sped away from the station, glancing in the rearview mirror only once. The figures were still standing there, in the doorway now, their hollow eyes following him as he disappeared into the fog. He didn't stop driving until he reached the safety of the next town, but even then, the image of those grinning faces haunted him. For days, weeks after, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching him. Every time he passed a gas station, he'd catch a glimpse of something in the shadows, a pale figure, a twisted grin, and his heart would race. Ethan vowed never to drive that road again, but sometimes late at night he wonders, what were those things, and why had they let him go? But more than that, he fears the day he'll look in the mirror and see one of those grinning figures standing right behind him.